All right, good afternoon, everyone. How are you guys doing? Good, I love it. Look at this. I love this enthusiastic crowd. So again, my name is Megan Francis. I'm a visiting associate professor at the Kennedy School, and I will be returning in June to my home institution, the University of Washington. Today, I have the distinct honor of introducing my colleague and friend, Professor Khalil Muhammad. He is a professor of history, race, and public policy at Harvard Kennedy School and the Suzanne Young Murray Professor at the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Studies. He is also the founding faculty director of the Initiative for Institutional Anti-Racism and Accountability at the Kennedy School. And he is also the former director of the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture, a division, of course, of the New York Public Library System and the world's leading library and archive of global Black history. And before leading the Schomburg Center, Khalil was an associate professor at Indiana. Archival excavation of the development of criminal justice statistics about how we think, how we research and talk about Black criminality. It's a book whose implications ring especially true in the current moment's push for big data. But before all of this success, I met Khalil while he was an assistant professor at Indiana and I was a young postdoc in the law school. We were two scholars from different disciplines interested in the intersection of race, criminal punishment, and American politics. And the thing that rings true from the very beginning when I met Professor Muhammad to today is how much he makes space and makes time for others. So if you'll please join me in welcoming Professor Muhammad to the stage. I'm so excited.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you, Megan. That's really kind, and I'm very proud of Megan's accomplishments. She's here because she had the courage to help the Kennedy School out in a moment of crisis with regard to being able to teach about race and racism in the age of Trump. And so I'm grateful for her contributions to what's happening in that school, that important place. I'm also grateful to Krishna for inviting me to present. Where's Krishna? Yes. And for the faculty and staff of the African American Studies Department and the Hutchins Center, as well as the fellows who were here. There are a lot of faces I don't know, and so I'm excited to meet other people and hear your thoughts and ideas. And for those who I do know, like my own team, Miriam and Siraj, Inge, who are here, and others, thanks for coming out. The Miseducation of the Black Bourgeoisie is the working title of one chapter in a book of essays thematically linked by a larger focus on understanding how public history, public memory, and political commemoration, as well as political weaponization of the civil rights movement helps explain certain aspects of Black elite leadership today. So that's a lot, not so much for words, but because it's a little different than what you might think. I'm interested in how popular memory, political commemoration, and weaponization, as well as public history of the civil rights movement, helps possibly explain certain aspects of Black elite leadership today. I have some ways to go on this project, and so to be clear, this is a work in progress, and I welcome all feedback and suggestions. A few disclaimers. I'm not attempting to describe or quantify class differences, as so much of the great work of Bill Wilson and so many other social scientists are hard at work doing in this moment. I am trying to add something to what we know about Black elite sensibilities, perspectives, and ideologies. I'm trying to clarify how the Obama and Trump presidencies change how we understand Black elite class as it has evolved over the past 50 years. Much of the sociological work was done before the age of Obama began, and much of the autobiographical, memoir, reporting, literature And the explosion of self-help books across the 1990s and 2000s also occurred before our first black president. A word about terms. I'm interested in these words, bourgeoisie, elites, leadership class, but I'm not committed right now to them. So I use these terms mostly interchangeably and ecumenically. Tommy Shelby, great chair of the department and a friend, has been concerned about the basis for racial solidarity in much of his work. And his newest book, I want to remind you, is a radical intervention in how we ought to think about those who Du Bois once called the submerged tenth, not as the helpless in need of uplift, but as people making rational political decisions given the society that we have bequeathed to them. So when he writes, yet I also defend a conception of black solidarity that is not only or even primarily concerned with questions of identity, but that urges a joint commitment to defeating racism, to eliminating unjust racial inequalities, and to improving the material life prospects of those racialized as black, especially the most advantaged. This he wrote in his first book. My response is that how have black elites come to view their individual success as the basis for defeating racism? I also want to complicate conservative labels as unhelpful given the broad intersections of material success with conservative attitudes, or as E. Franklin Frazier once put it, all shades of articulate Negro thought are conservative. In other words, unlike my colleague Randy Kennedy here, I'm not interested in figuring out who's an Uncle Tom or who's a sellout. Although I think there's room to continue to explore the work of black conservatism, neoconservatism, and the line between neoconservatism and neoliberalism, that is not the project I'm setting out here. It seems to me also that black feminism may be the greatest challenge to the linkage between this notion of all articulate thought is inherently conservative, an area of scholarship that I have yet to turn to. My concern is neither what policy levers remain to be pulled or what balance of poor support, as my colleague David Ellwood once wrote about, is required to uplift the masses. My principal concern is what have black elites been saying to white elites for the past 50 years? What demands have they made not as outsiders, but as insiders? How much did they articulate a vision of history, of civil rights success as the basis for minimizing demands on white elites? In other words, how much did their narrating and interpreting the meaning of the post-civil rights era define political strategies at the level of civil society, in institutions, in the management suite, in the boardroom, at the tenure table, and so on. So I'm thinking about a concept that I've called post-assimilation, a term that neither denotes integration or desegregation, but considers the limits of either strategy with respect to changing the institutional landscape of civil society. Because, of course, we know blacks have always been used as a tool of white contestations over power. From the Constitutional Convention to the race baiting of the Atlanta governor's race in 1906 and the ensuing racial pogrom that nearly destroyed the first capital of black America, there's no moment in American history when the Negro problem or race relations, or identity politics, as it is, of course, referred to today, was not central to how competing factions of white America sought to use the image of the black to make their closing argument. And while black people have made much of the kaleidoscopic role they have played to their advantage, the role is fraught with peril. Just as Trump and Bloomberg's competing Super Bowl ads demonstrate, positioning black women as beneficiaries of their political agendas, or the journalist imagination of Nicole Hannah-Jones' 1619 Project, or Albert Murray's formulation of black folks as the quintessential or omni-Americans. For what Skip once called the crossover generation, what might have seemed temporary now looks permanent, hardwired into the American subconscious, that is, the role of blacks as political fodder for competing visions of white contestations of power, may in fact be hardwired into the American subconscious or a preloaded template in the playbook of American politics. Isn't this what Jordan Peele had in mind in his satirical horror movie about neo-slave markets run by white liberals in the distant suburbs? The engine of prosperity, of vigor, of life itself runs on black body parts. What's left but more of the same? This is the question I'm asking based on the historical record, from slavery to freedom, from segregation to the suburbs, and now from black police chiefs to a black president. It seems that the black elite, yet again, will follow the same path, play by the same rules, but somehow magically expect a different outcome. If Du Bois's first major work, which was in the making while writing essays that would become Souls of the Black Folks, that is, the Philadelphia Negro, he clearly understood that the anti-racist project of fair play would come with a both-and proposition. Blacks would fight their slavery-induced dysfunctions, which was his formulation, and whites would do the same. Crime pathologies on one side and white supremacy pathologies on the other. The leadership question today is 50 years of crime pathologies in the guise of the underclass, quote unquote, and locking up our own, but not the same can be said for whites of 50 years working on their white supremacy problem. Most of the post-civil rights era has turned on closing skills gaps or fixing broken black and brown people. Black elites, it seems, neglected Du Bois's advice and have not compelled white elites to change their behavior. This is debatable, I'll admit, therefore not settled fact. So I first began to think about these challenges while running the Schomburg Center and noting the gap between the interests of the many black elite, among whom care deeply about cultural institutions such as the Schomburg Center, and the fact of its institutional core assets being central to how we have come to learn about Black's life, as well as the actual governance structure of the New York Public Library. I took the experience and insights of the relationship of black elites to the NYPL and the governance role and responsibility over the Schomburg Center as a kind of ethnographic insight, looking at the Obama administration. I was selected there in 2011 and finished out my term roughly over the same period of Obama's final term in 2016. And in light of that experience of thinking about this core cultural institution of Black America and the relationship of the black elite to it, it gave me a bit of perspective on how to think about the Obama administration. And so I wrote in the Sunday Review of the New York Times at that time, we now live in a post-assimilation America. The 50-year-old rules for racial advancement are obsolete. There is no racial barrier left to break. There's no office in the land to which an African American can ascend, from mayor to attorney general and the presidency, that will serve as a magical platform for saving black and brown people from our nation's racist past. We cannot engineer a more equitable nation simply by dressing up institutions in more shades of brown. Instead, we must confront structural racism and the values of our institutions. Mr. Obama's election was, by any historical measure, the apex of the civil rights period. So many black, white, Latino, and Asian Americans saw in him the fulfillment of Dr. King's vision. The notion that the blood and courage of civil rights heroes had led to that moment was captured in the iconography of the campaign. Obama supporters from Atlanta to Chicago wore T-shirts illustrated with the profiles of Dr. King and Mr. Obama side by side. Jay-Z expressed a liturgy of the age in verse. Rosa Parks sat so Martin Luther could walk. Martin Luther walked so Barack Obama could run. Barack Obama ran so all the children can fly. But the exceptionalism of Mr. Obama's biography couldn't save us from the Tea Party revolution, Republican obstructionism, police brutality, voter suppression, Islamophobia. We now know that no individual, no matter how singular, can bend the moral arc of the universe. Not even Dr. King could. The Dr. King we choose to remember every year was indeed the symbolic beacon of the civil rights movement, but the Dr. King we forget worked within institutions to transform broken systems, not broken people. He never positioned himself as a paragon of progress, nor did he allow others to become complacent. In his last book, which of course for many has gotten a lot more attention, and again, Tommy and Brandon here have focused on Dr. King more recently, warned in Where Do We Go From Here that the movement was already hobbled by delusion. The majority of white Americans consider themselves sincerely committed to justice for the Negro, he wrote. They believe that American society is essentially hospitable to fair play and to steady growth toward a middle-class utopia embodying racial harmony. But unfortunately, this is a fantasy of self-deception and comfortable vanity. We must recognize that institutions are far more powerful than individuals, no matter how many people of color can be counted in leadership. Structural racism is immune to identity politics. That Eric Holder and Loretta Lynch became attorney generals, for example, was the starting point for the possibility of federal criminal justice reform, not the reform in itself. In addition, black people in charge of or embedded in institutions that have not atoned for their history of racism can make it easier for those institutions to ignore or dismiss present-day claims of racial bias. That's because the path to leadership has often meant accepting institutions as they are, not disrupting them. As the failure of black political leadership in Baltimore to protect black lives and the limited ability of black police chiefs to curb brutality in their own departments demonstrate people of color can inherit or perpetuate structures of inequality. Many institutions of government, finance, and higher education were built on the backs of enslaved African Americans and remain haunted by that history today. Some Black Lives Matter activists have already embraced the possibilities of a post-assimilation era. Quote, "We don't need more elected officials that are just black," Charlene Carruthers, national director of BYP 100, said to a reporter. "We need champions in the city." So here we are, firmly planted in new territory. There's no turning back, so it seems. Elite positions by themselves have not ended systemic racism. Access alone has not been sufficient to secure agency. And this, I would add, is the generous view. My colleague, Keeanga Yamada Taylor, who has written brilliantly, most recently in her book, Race for Profit, but in her earlier book, From Black Power to Black Lives Matter, she says that we are now in a period of post-black politics. She shares my concern about the failures of black political elites to change systems, but she is more centrally concerned with formal political behavior. Noting, quote, "After 40 years of an electoral strategy, black elected officials' inability to alter the poverty, unemployment, and housing and food insecurity of their constituents cast significant doubt on the existing electoral system as a viable vehicle for black liberation. Black elected officials obscure their actions under a cloak of imagined racial solidarity," she notes, while ignoring their role as arbiters of political power who willingly operate in a political terrain designed to exploit and oppress African Americans and other working class people. There have always been class differences among African Americans, she continues, but this is the first time those class differences have been expressed in the form of a minority of blacks wielding significant political power and authority over the majority of black lives. This raises critical questions about the role of the black elite in continuing the freedom struggle, and about what side are they on. Note, I said mine was the generous view. So if we return to Carter G. Woodson's 1933 Miseducation of the Negro, coupled with E. Franklin Frazier's 1957 Black Bourgeoisie, we might discover some patterns and pathways that we didn't fully appreciate in a time when the imagined end of segregation was potentially a kind of racial utopia. Since we've gotten there, it seems to me this is an opportunity to look back. And of course, getting there is air quotes. So Woodson, of course, as many of you know, but for the few who don't, writes a polemic aimed at the failures of a then black elite, well-educated class. He has lots of euphemisms for these folks throughout, but mostly he describes them as miseducated Negroes. His insistence is that while they have received the best education that the nation could offer at the time, mostly in the South, he sees that this education is of little use, in his own words, if it is not aimed towards a liberatory project. He's also deeply concerned that their miseducation is not just their own political or ideological choices, but in fact, that they have received a bad education, that their education was divorced of political content and historical meaning-making that would have fortified them to see segregation as the aim of education and not their own individual success. And so in this, he writes as in this example about how the elite of the 1930s treat the black poor. He notes, quote, "This attitude of the educated Negro toward the masses results partly from the general trend of all persons toward selfishness, but it works more disastrously among the Negroes than among the whites, because the lower classes of the latter have had so much more opportunity," that is, of poor whites. When a white man sees persons of his own race tending downward to a level of disgrace, he does not rest until he works out some plan to lift up such unfortunates to higher ground. But the Negro forgets the delinquents of his race and goes out of his way to feather his own nest. And he has done so in leaving the masses in their popular churches. I'll just note here as a side note, my work in condemnation of blackness speaks directly to what we might call the tipping point of when too many whites face systemic failure and the ways in which the nation establishes public policies to lift them up. This might be the first part of the story of the New Deal state, of which the second part of that story might be playing out in the midst of our deaths of despair from the opioid crisis. So I offer it to you as a way of thinking about whether Carter G. Woodson got it right or not. He also notes that the black elite often take the bait of the historical narratives and popular histories aimed at the black community, and that is a generous, complicated black community. He notes, quote, "A few years ago, the author himself happened to listen to a conversation of Negro lawyers in one of our southern cities in which they unanimously conceded practically every contention set forth in this program of propaganda. They denounced, therefore, all Reconstructionists who advocated equality and justice for all. These Negroes had the biased point of view of the writers like Claude Bowers, one of the racist historians of that time period, and had never been directed to the real history of that drama. Du Bois's Black Reconstruction, as you well know, in his own treatment of the propaganda of history, published in 1935, just 2 years after Woodson, also spoke to this problem. That is, the large majority of educated Negroes in the United States have accepted segregation and have become its fearless champions," Woodson writes. Woodson also notes that African Americans in this leadership class as business owners, which was the gold standard for individual success in the segregated South, aside from the professions of teaching and the ministry, he notes that they were likely to exploit the black community as much as anyone else. Some of this educated class joined with unprincipled real estate men in keeping Negroes out of desirable parts of the city and confining them to unsanitary sections. Such persons helped the profiteer to collect from Negroes, thus concerned a larger rental than that exacted from whites for the same property. Not being learned, he notes, in the history and background of the race, they figure out that there is no hope for the masses, and they decide then that the best thing they can do is to exploit these people, for at least then they can use their own accumulations selfishly. Such persons have no vision and therefore perish at their own hands. Of course, you know now with Marcia Chatterleen's work, Nathan Connolly's work on racial capitalism among African Americans in the late 20th century, again, the moment to revisit Woodson's insights suggests to us that he was seeing something on the ground in that moment that is a legacy and continuation of our present. Turning to Fraser's critique of elites, Fraser's was even more polemical in 1957, although I'll note, as Tommy himself has noted, Du Bois mostly signed off on Fraser. Fraser had come to wrestle with black Marxism himself, along with Du Bois, in a period of interwar struggle, and by interwar I mean by the 1930s, bracketed by World War I and the failures of that period and participation of African Americans to gain the true measure of a manly citizenship, and then anticipating in the Great Depression what would happen on the popular front with a left challenge to the nation and the role that collective union labor movement would play. In this, for Fraser, an African American business class seemed least equipped and most unwilling to take on the potential of a radical progressive popular front. He notes the myth of Negro business has also been strengthened by the encouragement with which the white community has given to the belief of Negroes that is the white community, has given to the belief of Negroes that the accumulation of wealth through business will solve their problems. Negro salesmen are being featured in the public relations literature sent out by corporations. Yet no Negro businessmen are taken into the white business group, which own and control the life of the American community. The white community is assured, nevertheless, that the Negro leaders who propagate the myth of Negro business are uncompromising enemies of any radical doctrines. Just to state it plainly, those who have access as Negro salesmen to corporations have already proven themselves to be divorced of any quote-unquote radical doctrines. The extent to which these false notions influence the outlook of Negroes cannot better be illustrated, Fraser writes, than by the case of the Negro Pullman porter who owned his home and 4 shares of stock, valued at about $80, in a large American corporation. He declared that he was against the policies of Franklin Delano Roosevelt and the New Deal because they taxed men of property like himself in order to assist lazy working men. So a year ago, for Black History Month, I was a featured speaker at a Jack and Jill function. I didn't mean that to be a throwaway line. I forgot where I was. I thought I was at Harvard, sorry. I was about to explain what Jack and Jill is. So,
We know some people who were not invited.
all right. So I was a featured speaker at a Jack and Jill function, an elite social club whose membership consists of the Black middle and upper class, depending on the branch and its local inventory of African Americans. Its local inventory of African Americans with steady paychecks and better than average income. The host of this event, in a gesture of collective aggrandizement, applauded everyone in the room for being Black history makers, simply by going to work every day in their professional jobs. This particular branch of Jack and Jill in my local community is made up of Black 1%ers, Wall Street types, corporate C-suiters, and lawyers, nonprofit CEOs, and yes, even a Harvard tenured professor. Even though my family is not, nor has ever been, by choice, a part of Jack and Jill. Still, I took exception to my host's comment. Did he really think that these hardworking, successful women and men were moving the race forward, achieving Black history by simply getting up and going to work every day? Was it just me, or was this a self-serving myth? By doing their jobs at Chase Manhattan or Bank of America or Paul Weiss, they were, by definition, in this formulation, moving the needle. They were articulating what David Levering Lewis described as, quote, the Horatio Alger Creed of collective betterment. I'll say that again. The Horatio Alger Creed, that is a bootstrapping creed of collective betterment. It's an oxymoron, of course, but so too is classical economic liberalism. In the late 1940s, E. Franklin Frazier used a survey of, quote, Negro business and education. He cited it in Black Bourgeoisie, and this is what he observed. Many of these students, coming from poor homes and with inadequate academic preparation, have undoubtedly seized upon business education as a means to rise to middle-class status. They have also been told that by becoming moneymakers, they would help the Negro to achieve economic independence in American life. But the present generation of Negro college students, that is in the 1950s, this being a generation who were the older cousins and siblings to the civil rights generation, this older generation of college students do not wish to recall their past. As they reside to school in their, if they go to school in their automobiles, they prefer to think of the money which they will earn as professional and businessmen, for they have been taught that money will bring them justice and equality in American life, and they propose to get money. Now, just so you don't think, as I've tried to lay out here, that this is a veiled and subtle way of calling them sellouts, or somehow articulating the notion that because they pursued professional success and money making, my point is that that in and of itself is not the problem. The problem is to define that individual success and pursuit of money making as anti-racist work. And that is what Fraser himself is speaking to. So one way that I am collecting the evidence of this problem is to observe, of course, what happens in our contemporary moment. In 2009, Ellis Coase wrote a rejoinder to an earlier book called Rage of a Privileged Class, published in the 1990s. This rejoinder, published in 2009, was called End of Anger. And in this book, he was revisiting the problem that black middle managers and a few of those who had broken into the C-suite at the time in the 1990s were complaining about the failure of corporate America to get rid of a glass ceiling that would have fundamentally changed their access to the most elite positions of corporate power in America. When Obama was elected, Ellis Coase had a hunch that many of that generation were far more optimistic than they had been 20 years before about the prospects of African American mobility and success. And so he pulled together two groups, a focus group of Harvard black MBAs, the alumni of this university, as well as a group of alumni younger of A Better Chance, a pipeline program to boarding schools. Now, we could talk during the Q&A about things that he observed, but I want to point you to an appendix that he wrote at the end of this book, End of Anger. The appendix was titled 10 Rules of Success. And the question that prompted those rules was this: obviously, there is no magic formula for economic success in this country, but could you sum up what you consider to be the most important factors contributing to individual success in America? This was posed to and answered by the Harvard MBAs. Rule number 1 through 8 were roughly work hard, be ambitious, cultivate fabulous networks of successful people, all the stuff that all those motivational speakers have been talking about for a long time. They're a little quieter these days, but you know, the people for whom Oprah and them were doing a nice dance between her work on national television and their work in the trenches. Okay. So rule number 9 said, believe. And I quote, "There is no other country in the world besides America where a little girl from a third world country, the daughter of a teacher and a taxi driver, could arrive and in less than a decade reach the top percentile in terms of education and income." Coates quoted one of the respondents. "Racial issues aside," she continued, "America is a blessed, magical place. I don't think any black Harvard Business School MBA would admit to a glass ceiling. If that is how you see the world, you have defeated yourself," observed one correspondent. Rule number 10, never talk about race or gender if you can avoid it, other than to declare it does not matter. And one responded, quote, "To engage in any serious and critical discussion of race," they cautioned, "is to risk being marginalized and therefore to risk your career. You cannot create bonds of trust if you dare to discuss social inequalities in business or social settings with whites in the power structure. So any hint of social activism must be purged from your very being in order to form the bonds that are required to build trust." Note, Fraser said, all the black folks selling for corporations in the 1950s had been purged of quote-unquote radical doctrines. So, the pattern seems to have repeated to varying degrees, generation after generation. So, is it fair to ask, is the idea of black individual success as a standard of racial progress wrong-headed, or has it simply been poorly executed? So I'm going to pose an empirical question of which I don't have the answer yet, but I think it's worth answering. What is the relationship of professional school training to the leadership choices of black elites? Woodson, for example, critiqued higher education curriculum. He said, quote, "The bias, which by this he meant in his own words, Eurocentrism in the classics, did not stop at this point, for it invaded the teaching of the professions. Negro law students were told that they belonged to the most criminal element in the country. And an effort was made to justify the procedure in the seats of injustice where law was interpreted as being one thing for the white man and a different thing for the Negro." Even in this intervention in Woodson's voice, might we better understand why that same year that the book was published, the NAACP refused to take on the case of the Scottsboro Boys, as my colleague Megan Francis has so brilliantly written about. And that for the next generation refused to see the fight over equal protection under the law and due process in the criminal justice system as a key pillar of an anti-racist project. In medical school, Negroes, Woodson wrote, were likewise convinced of their inferiority and being reminded of the role as germ carriers. Other diseases to which Negroes easily fall prey were mentioned to point out the race as an undesirable element when this condition was due to the Negro's economic and social status. Of course, from the work of Evelyn Hammonds, of David Williams, and Dorothy Roberts, these are the so-called social determinants of health disparities. And yet, and still, the degree to which they write against the grain as compared to what professional school education, middle school schools, and public health schools remains today ought to concern us. The role of higher education and professional schools in particular have a foundational role in maintaining traditions of structural racism. Their policies of excluding most of the US population were intentionally implemented and must, of course, if things are to change, be intentionally eliminated. These institutions were not just white and male, and for most schools for the propertied and the privileged. Since their founding, colleges and universities produced knowledge that centered the lived experiences of those who had always populated them. The defense of racial inequality as a skills gap problem of broken black and brown people is the intellectual tradition and social foundation upon which these schools stand. More recently, our medical schools, business schools, policy schools, public health schools, law schools have embraced a commitment to diversifying the faculty and staff with, of course, limited results, present company included. But most have only scratched the surface of changing the core curriculum of how professionals are trained in the first place. Dismantling intentional systems of exclusion is not just what happens out there. The defense of extractive policies and maldistribution of resources on the basis of racial logics starts here. In our training of future policymakers, in our elite business schools, in law schools, as well as at MIT down the street or any other place. We train students who become leaders of civil society to see racism as an artifact of the past, as something aberrational, as an elective we might opt into, like exploring the great philosophy of W.E.B. Du Bois in the class of the great Dr. Cornel West. If I might quote from the Harvard Kennedy School's own strategic diversity plan, taking a class on race as a, quote, learning opportunity for underrepresented perspectives. So the empirical question is this. I'm planning to do a national survey of professional school curricula with a focus on how much of the core includes race and ethnic studies scholarship. The survey will capture data from all types of professional schools, from law, business, etc. If my hypothesis is correct that the vast majority of these schools rely on curricula that excludes advances in socially engaged scholarship of the past 50 years, the book will have to ultimately make a case for why this has to change. But this would affirm Woodson's perspective going back to the 1930s about the miseducation of professional Negroes. Complementing the curricula survey will be a comprehensive scan of the demographics of latter faculty at these same schools in an effort to link how core faculty representation also has a bearing on the relationship of lived experience, social bias, and cultural competency to how students perceive what power and leadership actually look like. The goal here is to disrupt the myth of magical people of color, or, as Mitch Daniels of Purdue University, rare creatures, by showing that professional schools perpetuate this myth by excluding categories of knowledge produced by a disproportionate number of people of color. In other words, if their work is not in the core curriculum, why should they even be in the classroom? My experiences at the Kennedy School have been very instructive. It's first time teaching in a professional school. And it was quite important, therefore, to recognize that the diversity and inclusion belonging work at the Kennedy School has been pointing in exactly the opposite direction away from anti-racist commitments. It does not have as a goal of transforming the business or core operations of the school, what it teaches, promotes to future and current policymakers, for example, which has had severe consequences on racial disparities and outright racism in police contact and state violence. You don't have to just take my personal experience for it. You can listen to William Bratton in a March 2018 lecture he gave at the Heritage Foundation. He then, 2 years into retirement, was asked to give a state of the state address for American policing, and it was introduced by former Attorney General under Ronald Reagan, Edwin Meese, who introduced him. Meese had this to say: he has, in a sense of Bratton, invented a language. Nobody knew that there was such a thing as CompStat until he came along and developed it. And now almost every large police department in the country is using some form of CompStat, Meese stated. Bratton then took the mic, thanking Meese and letting the audience know that they had first met at the Harvard Kennedy School during convenings to explore best practices in policing in the 1980s and 1990s. Bratton credited these Kennedy School convenings for being more responsible, quote, than just about any other government activity that I'm aware of over the last 50 years for having shaped American policing and shaping it for the better. At this same policing summit, Bratton said that by the 1990s, the policing profession had finally figured out how to get past what he called the flawed Koerner Legacy. Police leaders started coming together at a series of executive sessions led by the faculty at the Kennedy School. There, quote, we began to get it right, he noted. The causes of crime is people. There is an inconvenient truth that cops go where the criminals are. Data-driven or evidence-based policing is not biased policing. The disparities are not a policing issue. It is about behavior. You have the crime numbers, and they are self-evident. Now, of course, the timeliness of Bloomberg and his own record based on these policies ought to suggest to us that the stakes couldn't be higher. But the question of whether or not more black people at the Harvard Kennedy School in the room at the time when these meetings were occurring would have made a difference is largely answered by the choice of black elites to support these policies, as James Forman has so brilliantly written. That they did it out of an expression of their own commitment to civil rights in the post-King era mitigates some of this. In this way, post-civil rights leaders reimagined Dr. King as a crimes crusader. In 1995, 1 year after Bill Clinton signed the biggest crime bill in American history, the nation's first black U.S. attorney, according to Forman, for the District of Columbia, Eric Holder, announced a major anti-crime initiative called Operation Ceasefire at a Martin Luther King Day celebration in Arlington. Quote, did Martin Luther King successfully fight the likes of Bull Connor, Eric Holder noted, so that we could ultimately lose the struggle for civil rights to misguided or malicious members of our own race? This wasn't the politics of respectability. It was what Forman calls the politics of responsibility. Dr. King's legacy had become fodder for a national trend of personal responsibility Jeremiads aimed at black America. This moment peaked about a decade ago, just when Barack Obama, an exemplar of propriety, kicked off his presidential candidacy and Bill Cosby was wrapping up a national call-out tour dispensing the gospel of tough love in black communities. And of course, before he was finally indicted for sexual predation. Woodson would have noted, quote, that miseducated Negroes would not have in fact changed things. With miseducated Negroes in control themselves, however, it is doubtful that the system would be very much different from what it is, or that it would rapidly undergo change. The Negroes thus placed in charge would be the products of the same system and would show no more conception of the task at hand than do the whites who have educated them and shaped their mindset. They would have them function. Black folk may have more sympathy, but they don't necessarily have more vision. taught from books on the same basis, trained by Caucasians of the same prejudices, or by Negroes of enslaved minds, one generation of Negro teachers after another have served for no higher purpose than to do what they are told to do. In other words, a Negro teacher instructing Negro children is in many respects a white teacher thus engaged, for the program is in each case about the same. Now, of course, this is shot through with lots of racial essentialism, but there is a core point, and that is, if the curriculum of professional schools does not reflect lived experiences and critiques and scholarship or the science of anti-racism going back to the 1930s, why would we expect professionally trained lawyers and criminal justice officials and politicians to behave otherwise? So in all of this, I also worry about my health in engaging in doing this kind of scholarship, or what we might even call its own version of leadership work. I worry about everyone's health in this room. I'm saddened by the premature demise of our beloved Charles Ogletree and Lonnie Guinier. Who knows why they both were failed by debilitating brain disease here at this university. But if David Williams teaches us anything, it is that we can't ignore the physical and psychic toll this work takes. Part of the miseducation has been believing that shouldering twice the load of excellence was not only good for the race, but the only real mark of a true leader. That doesn't work for me. It looks like Sisyphean work to me now. Too much effort pushing up only to be nearly crushed by the boulder's descent. What about using power to flatten the slope? But this is, what I would argue, white people's work. We may still be stuck pushing up the boulder, but is there a job to dynamite the mountain? So, what does it mean then to reject this form of leadership? Or even to reject the kind of American optimism that passes in our political culture for most elites? What does it mean to consider counseling black strivers of the 21st century to make a clear distinction between anti-racist work and symbolic racial advancement? Becoming a first, a second, a third, or a fourth in a company or nonprofit organization or public agency is no longer, in my opinion, any form of anti-racist work. It may be evidence of progress along the lines of racial representation, assuming the new woman of color is not filling a slot of her predecessor. To be anti-racist would mean leaning into organizational change. It would mean questioning tradition. It would mean directing the resources and business model of the organization to address racial and gender disparities. Too often, elites claim that by their being successful, they are helping to change the world or to make it a better place. In most cases, this simply isn't true. At best, many businesses only create value for their shareholders and customers, and depending on what they are selling and how they make what they sell, they may be producing a net loss to broader social and environmental goals in society. They might also be fleecing their black customers. So it's not acceptable, this sort of formulation that every time I get paid, black people do better. Or as Jelani Cobb reminded me just the other day, that Don King once said, the best thing I can do for poor black people is not be one of them. I was talking to a very concerned, liberal, older white gentleman a few years ago who was supporting some work that I was doing at the time through fundraising. And he seemed deeply troubled by something he'd heard from one of the black 01 percenters, whose name I will not mention, but a very successful black corporate individual. This gentleman had been running a national organization doing mentorship and direct social service with African American youth, and he felt tired by the work, particularly in light of Donald Trump's election. He wasn't sure that it was amounting to the kind of change that he had expected. And so he reached out to this 0.01 percenter to ask his advice. What should I make of this? To which he responded that those kids of yours should work hard just like I did. I grew up in the projects. They should be ambitious and keep studying. That's what'll make a difference. So when he repeated this to me, my white interlocutor, a friend, I said to him, does that make any sense in a country deeply concerned about the declining fortunes of the white working class? If in fact the white working class, who have always benefited both by material advantages and their own psychological benefits of whiteness, are struggling to imagine that their children will do better than they have done in this society, why is it that a black elite person would be telling you, a white elite person, that what ails young black people in America is that they don't work hard enough? So, rereading the mid-century debate about which strategy, a socialist turn uniting black and red in a popular front of labor-led radicalism versus a reformist integrationist approach, would lead to the end of racial terror and redlining, which seem to reproduce the same leadership impasse we find ourselves in today. Revisiting debates with Du Bois at center stage, flanked by Ralph Bunche and Howard University's Young Turks on one side and the elder statesman Walter White of the NAACP and National Urban League leadership on the other, feels like the argument that black voters, generationally divided today, are having about Bernie versus Biden, or some rough approximation thereof. And to be clear, this historiography is as rich, nuanced, and important on its own terms as it was when first published. But there's one huge difference between then and now. We've seen the full arc of integrationist, reformist approaches play out. Obama's election, followed by Trump, isn't just another version of Reconstruction followed by a nadir. This is a fundamental break with the past, where any aspirational claims to holding out hope for racial justice by white moral proxy, as Gunnar Myrdal insisted, are tempered by a 50-year record of widening disparities within and outside and between black America. Educational and housing segregation, criminal justice, health and wealth gaps are over-indexed in the collective public conscience. And therefore, the continuation of the kind of water is wet research that we keep doing, seems to me, is not going to solve this problem. We have a much better sense that racism has political and economic value. It wins elections, sets market rates, and sells products from homes to clothing. Like money, race is an abstraction. It is a form of currency that we collectively agree assigns value to something tangible, like who should live where, in what neighborhood, or go to what school, or run this company, or museum, or college, or university, or whatever. And so I draw on the work of Nikhil Singh, as well as most recently Keeanga Yamata's work, where she notes, quote, the reality of a racialized political economy challenged the idea that inclusion in the financial and public services that for so long had excluded African Americans was enough to overcome the physical and economic devastation of black urban communities. Indeed, I have argued, she notes, that inclusion in those processes laid the basis for even greater exploitative and predatory practices, or what she calls predatory inclusion, in transactions involving the urban housing market. Remember what Woodson said about black real estate agents? Housing value in the United States continued to be scaled according to the proximity of African Americans, she writes in her newest book, Race for Profit. The turn to inclusion was only allowable by maintaining other forms of inclusion. Credit inclusion became possible by holding the line of neighborhood exclusion. The value of that asset will be weighed by the race or ethnicity of whoever possesses it. Keeanga's notion of predatory inclusion is an indispensable analytical framework for taking seriously the limits of how leadership was defined for the past 2 generations. In Skip's essay, The Parable of Talents, he wrote, quote, for the first time, we have a different presence of black agents, black editors, black reviewers. Blacks now run and own record labels. They produce films, black concerts. The old black talent, white management pattern has finally started to break down. With the active recruitment of minorities into the mainstream, blacks have an institutional authority without precedent in American cultural history. And as we know, if Skip were here today, and certainly if he were to participate in Q&A, would remind us, as he often does, at the meteoric growth of the black middle class and how we have to take seriously their presence. It would have been hard, however, to not have a measure of optimism, as Skip did, for such possibilities in 1996 when he co-authored The Future of the Race with the good brother Dr. Cornel West, or should I say, Brother Cornell. And yet the problem of board members and leadership at the top was so much a crisis a few years ago that even I was catapulted dizzyingly to the board of the Museum of Modern Art. Which, in saying this, is my point, that this is the kind of cosmetic work where we scramble to reposition black people rather than to take seriously the institutional requirements of transformation. In the same book, As Future of the Race, Cornell offers a different view, channeling Du Bois's 1948 revision of the Talented Tenth. And here he quotes Du Bois. When I came out of college into the world of work when Du Bois came out, I realized that it was quite possible that my plan of training a talented tenth might put in control and power a group of selfish, self-indulgent, well-to-do men whose basic interest in solving the Negro problem was personal freedom and unhampered enjoyment and use of the world without any real care or certainty, or certainly no arousing care as to what became of the mass of American Negroes or of the mass of any people. My talented tenth, I could see, might result in a sort of interracial free-for-all, with the devil taking the hindmost and the foremost taking anything they could lay their hands on. West's perspective was quite distinct from Skip's. Quote, they must not be too frank, he noted, and outspoken, and must never fail to flatter and to be pleasant in order to lessen white unease, these black elites of the 1990s. Of white unease and discomfort, things we might refer to today as white innocence and white fragility. Needless to say, this is not the raw stuff, Cornell continued, for healthy relations between black and white people. Yet this suppression of black rage, the reducing, the boiling to a simmer, backfires in the end. It reinforces a black obsession with the psychic scars, ontological wounds, and existential bruises that tend to reduce the tragic to the pathetic. Instead of exercising agency, let me repeat, instead of exercising agency or engaging in action against the odds, one may wallow in self-pity, acknowledging the sheer absurdity of it all. And the historical observation is this: neither Skip nor Cornell could know for sure what was to come. But we now know where we sit. In light of Obama's 2 terms and the Trump backlash, the question is, does this moment require a leadership perspective that has not yet been the dominant one? A road to travel that few black elites have ventured down. What to do different in the age of Trump and beyond is not an empirical question, but defining a pattern of racial leadership predicated on core assumptions about what would happen when black people gained leadership positions after the fall of legal segregation should in fact be reinterrogated. And if this question is already being answered by other folks, I'm happy to know of their work. This is new for me. Thank you very much. I welcome your questions at this time.
I just want to say that Skip is watching online, and thanks you for a great job, and for the shout out to him, to Cornell, to Tommy, and to Brendan.
Thank you so much, Professor Muhammad. I really love your work. My question is just about this, your thesis. So you talk about curriculum, but my thing is, I want to ask about, and what role do you think just practices plays in these spaces in cultivating what you might call a black elite? And this is what I mean. So I went to Morehouse College. In terms of information, critical conscious information, that was totally available, and the students could get up and put on their suits and talk about black history as fruitful as anybody. But then as soon as they step off the podium, they're about to go interview for J.P. Morgan, things like that. So my thing is like, how in terms of like the information gap, of course it seems to be true, but as soon as I leave Cornell's course and receive the information, if I'm a white student or a black student, I'm still immediately going back into the social space of practices and whiteness and things like that. And that seems like that's doing more work in the cultivation of black elite than even in the classroom lacking information.
Yeah, I think you're restating the dilemma. So to restate your question, if I have posited, as Woodson himself posited, that miseducation is a core problem, meaning people don't know their history, aren't fortified with the knowledge of how to assess the system as it is, that they might find themselves either complicit in it or active agents in oppressing others. That would be Woodson. So you're saying even when people have been exposed to this information, they may willingly opt out of the kind of system change. And that to me is the both-and proposition. We must first address what we might call a core problem of the miseducation as a structural problem. That is that most people aren't at Morehouse, and increasingly fewer and fewer are. So even in a segregated context, which is the irony of HBCUs, we're educating black folks to function mostly within a segregated economy. Now, that desegregation means that a lot more black folks are not even going to places like Morehouse to get the kind of education that you described. It's not an accident that Howard University has produced some of the most incredible anti-racist black feminist scholars in this country. So it's not to say the curriculum, it may be insufficient, but it is indispensable. On the second part of the question, partly what I'm trying to split the difference here is to suggest that rather than beating up black elites over the last 50 years for either their own false consciousness or for their own avarice, I'm suggesting that if we give them the benefit of the doubt of having made the best choices, your individual self in this elite environment of power, and figuring that you only have limited levers to pull. Maybe you are the first person to establish Black History Month celebration or Diversity Day on the job, or to get that affinity group going. Or maybe you raise a difficult question in a boardroom about whether or not we should raise the rates on homeowner lending in black communities. That kind of work is insufficient in hindsight. Right? I'm a historian, so part of my job is to figure out to the extent to which those choices made the kind of impact that people self-consciously thought would make the impact. So finally to say, to your problem, we have to be more aggressive. Otherwise, we're only going to find ourselves making similar constrained choices and expecting a different outcome. Yes?
I was just going to, I mean, at the end of the day, doesn't it come down to, I'm thinking about populations. I'm thinking about the data of populations and the fact that, you know, Black Americans in particular, those who descend from chattel slavery, make up 14% of the population, right? And white Americans make up 70% of the population and own most 90+% of the resources. So at the end of the day, doesn't it come down to, even if all the Black elites sort of fortify, it's almost like, I'm just gonna to say this flat-footed, it's almost like Negroes with guns, right? Like, even if you have 14% of the population armed with the knowledge, with all of it, and then in the institution and being aggressively challenging, you still have a 70% white population that the majority of which are kind of battling against that. So it's about numbers and also about basically a police state, which we have right here.
Yeah. So I tried to, I appreciate the question. It's a good question. So I tried to address this in my opening remarks with regard to the role that African Americans have played going back to the Constitutional Convention as the cipher for which competing notions of an America turned through white imaginations and fantasies. And so through us, white people projected their own sense of humanity. In which case, what is denied in that 14% demographic reality is the extraordinary multiplier effect of blackness as the linchpin of the American project. I didn't talk about Nikhil Singh's work, but Nikhil essentially says that republicanism and liberalism are defined by blackness. Without it, the whole thing falls apart. And if you accept that theoretical argument, then you could accept that we actually are the vehicle through which white elites have justified the kind of maldistribution of power and resources that they contain. And that without a black elite, We could use colonial intermediaries as a way of thinking about them. Playing a role, it would have left two white Americas to work out for themselves which version of America was going to actually win, a left or a right, a pluralistic open society or a fascist closed one. So the degree to which we have functioned in that formulation as the glue that holds all of this madness together seems to me that we do have a lot more power that is far beyond our demographic representation.
Hi, Professor Muhammad.
Where's the mic? Yes.
Have you thought about the extent to which the salience of prosperity gospel in the Black church plays a role in this miseducation at all?
I'm so glad you asked because, consider it Exhibit B. I have not thought through it enough for this paper, this part of the presentation, but I'm basically just saying thank you for reminding me how important it is. One of the things, just to lift up Woodson very quickly, in some ways, Black ministers were the whipping boys of his analysis. He was deeply, deeply disappointed in the role that what he called miseducated Negro ministers played in upholding segregation as a status quo, not only for their own miseducation, but as a consequence of it, as he would term, but also because they gained by playing along, by playing by the rules of segregation. And so, we've got Darrell Scott in Cleveland handing out $300 checks to Black folks at a Trump rally. So there's a lot to be said for that echo. But I'm just going to say thank you very much for bringing it up. It's important to add to the story. Yes.
Thank you so much for this very thought-provoking talk. Book recommendation, Charisma and the Fictions of Black Leadership by Erica Edwards.
Excellent.
It synthesizes a Black feminist critique of patriarchal Black leadership, elite bourgeois Black leadership.
Thank you. Thank
book
you.
Recommendation. I grew up in Jack and Jill. And at the risk of sounding somewhat defensive,
Yeah.
I want to offer some reflections that you sort of anticipated in your talk on your terminology and your method. In terms of your terminology, it seems to me like you're more interested in ideology than in a class of people, and that's what you said. But I bring that up to say, it seems to me like there are, I know for a fact that there are Black elites who are radicalized in elite institutions like Harvard, right? There's a general education course taught here on Black radicalism, right? And that seems to me a part of the professionalization of a Black leadership class that could, in effect, find itself engaging in radical Black activism. So what do I have in mind? I have in mind, as Robin D.G. Kelly points out in Hammer and Hoe, the fact that there were Black middle-class people donating funds to the International Legal Defense Fund that was defending the Scottsboro Boys, right? I have in mind Black elites who are financially supporting incarcerated family members while also fighting mass incarceration. Like, where is their education? Where is their radicalization occurring? And I would offer that it might not be happening at professional schools, right? But it might be happening in liberal arts education, right? It might be happening in the Graduate School of Arts and Sciences. Full disclosure, I took a oral exam field in Black radical thought with Professor West, right? My critique of racial capitalism is informed by the education that I received. And so I wonder if methodologically it might be useful to not just think exclusively about professional schools, but to think more broadly about liberal arts education and graduate schools, which are also training Black elites for leadership positions.
Yeah. So I like this question because it's pushing back against at least how I frame the argument. And so that, I want to get this right because Fraser was not very well liked, nor Woodson. Right, Brother West? Yeah, and you haven't done so well in the age of Obama either. So, as love, you know what I mean. So part of what I'm doing is staking a claim to a part of the story that is sort of getting it out there. And so that kind of nuance is, I think, what you're partly telling me is I have to acknowledge that evidence. What I want to say is that all of the resistance, the anti-racist resistance, the progressive resistance, the left part of the Democratic Party, the Philip Agnews and Nina Turners of the Bernie campaign, to some degree are all legacies of Black studies in the big tent sense of things. The relationship of whether it's community-based learning or college-based learning, the work that Barbara Ransby and Kathy Cohen have been doing in Chicago with Black. So it's not that that infrastructure isn't there, but partly what I'm saying is that infrastructure gets incredibly anemic at the highest levels of decision-making in this society. And so it works, it's magic from the outside in, and magic, it does work. I'm not diminishing that, and if I were to diminish it, it would be diminishing the power of the Black Power movement or Black freedom struggles more generally, which of course I'm not arguing in any way, shape, or form. But in trying to feel out the limits, what didn't work over the last 50 years, it seems to me, and I'm going to say this word partly because it's in my head, maybe it's provocative, I don't mean it in that way, but I don't want to be part of fetishizing all of our progressive power. So I want to move us from recognizing that if outside in and inside out has always been essentially the balance that moves political change and transformation, then it seems to me that the work we need to do is on the inside. That's where we've fallen short. And without, again, going down the black hole of adjudicating Obama's presidency, I'm happy to do that, but the most generous way I can put it is to say that it wasn't enough. Why it wasn't enough? I'm not going to be writing that book. But it wasn't enough. And so if the question is what then is required in a context where that kind of incredible symbolic power is necessary, a symbolic power that essentially absorbed the rays of blackness coming from Black Lives Matter and from Black progressive organizing, from I2M Harvard, from whatever pocket of anti-racist activism that a liberal arts program produced, it seems to me that that's what we want to disrupt. It's a both and. Yeah.
I was curious. It seems like the thrust of your coming research is going to be on curriculum. Is that correct?
That's just part of it. I mentioned that as an important empirical question I'd like to answer.
Well, it's curious because it seems to me that you're focusing perhaps on something that's a weak straw in the sense that curriculum itself is driven by the priorities of those who want to employ the graduates of that curriculum. Just by way of analogy, colonial education is pretty instructive in this regard. For years, there were debates about what should be taught in African colonial circumstances, and the French spent a lot of time trying to reform the educational system in West Africa, and it had absolutely no effect in terms of curricular change because people were employed once they got through the educational system on whether or not they spoke French correctly, right? So all of the nuancing of the African history, the African local circumstance and the like was tolerated by the students who had to learn it. But they then performed in reference to what was employing them on the other side of the diploma. And this strikes me as, in a broad, general way, as probably true with a lot of professional education in the United States. It's not so much what is included in the curriculum as what's rewarded in the job market.
I want to leave space for learning what you just described in the colonial period so we can follow up. I want to, if I heard you correctly, offer a response that would say the reason why I use the Kennedy School example of stop and frisk is to say that the Kennedy School is actually trains criminal justice policymakers to do a certain kind of work. It's going to happen one way or the other. And so it's not being divorced from the question of a kind of cultural product of African history, pre-colonial, to learning French to be a bureaucrat. That's certainly part of the landscape. My goal here is not to suggest that cancer researchers being trained here in the medical school are going to be better cancer researchers per se because they get more grounding in Black history. What I am saying is that in key aspects of professional school training, as in the example of public health or medical schools, where the question of the social determinants of health, the fact that this is brand new research, or research that remains still at the margins of the core of these very schools on our campus suggests to me that people are actually dying, because they're miseducated. And so that is about thinking more carefully about the way that in 2020, in a population that will be browner one way or the other. I mean, Black folks may not grow in significance, but most certainly non-Europeans will. This is life and death work, is kind of the point that I'm making. Yes?
No, I just want to thank you, though, my dear brother. This is so rich and so courageous. The work that you're doing, I can't wait till that second book comes out. I mean, my voice is gone from New Hampshire, you know. But I mean, your first book is the best book on white supremacy in the last 50 years, brother.
Thank you.
And the second one, we can't wait. But I just wonder, though, whether miseducation is getting at all of the different dimensions that you want. I think every bourgeoisie, no matter what color, tends to have dominant tendencies of cowardliness, conformity, and complacency. And education doesn't cut deep enough to deal with cowardliness. It doesn't dig deep enough to deal with complacency. You see what I mean? When I'm sitting here looking at Brother Preston Williams, what went into the formation of this brother in terms of lifting as he climbs? We have to be able to tell a story about the moral and spiritual formation of the Black bourgeoisie. So how is it that indifference sets in, that they don't want to lift as they climb? They don't really care about a young student coming in 1979, Cornell West, and he gonna keep track of me every week. You see what I mean?
Yeah.
Something went into the morals and spiritual formation of him as a Harvard professor. Whereas every other Harvard professor, Black or whatever, might not have that. And so there has to be something about, yes, the education, but it's a question of formation of will and the soul craft of it. And what happens when the money takes over? What happens when commodification and incorporation takes over? So that even come out of Jack and Jill, I can understand Brother Will, because my mother tried to get me in because she loved me, but they were trying to tame me and it didn't work, you know. But that's all right, I understand her love. She's trying to expose me to things from the ghetto, because we didn't ice skate in the ghetto, and they did. and I wanted to be exposed to stuff like that. They took you to museums. I wanted to go to museums, and we playing basketball all day. So I got access to that, and that was a love from her, but it had to do with my spiritual and moral formation. So that you've hit something so crucial. I think Frazier was hitting it too, but he was not. He didn't linger with it the way you linger with it, and you had a different level at this point in you. So that what would you say about that spiritual moral formation of our Black middle class, that we fall so quickly to the indifference toward folk on the block? We're just scared. We're fearful. We can't wait to fit in with careers and opportunities grabbing. You remember what James Baldwin said about Lorraine Hansberry? She never confused keeping the faith with making it. Mm-hmm. See, that's your tradition. Yeah. That's my tradition. You see what I mean? That's Preston's tradition. And even Skip himself, giving my critiques of that, brother, that he's somebody who's concerned about Black folk making sure they have a presence. The subject matter has a presence. Within his liberal framework, that's his conception of keeping faith. And in that sense, he's been quite marvelous. And we have other kind of criticisms of the brother, and he got criticisms of us. But it's that sense of service, something bigger than just your own individual career, connected to a community, a tradition, a history, a heritage of people who've been catching hell.
Yeah, thank you, Cornell. I mean, it's still this question of faith and moral courage. I have to admit, I don't have an easy answer for where to find it in the 21st century. I mean, well, but the point being, we know the data on declining membership in churches. We've already had a conversation about the prosperity gospel. And we know the political weaponization of sort of black ethical traditions vis-a-vis the religious church, going back to George Bush, and are still playing out in the context of the Trump era. So I don't know what mode of disruption that is not organic to your home, your neighborhood, your faith tradition, or your community. I don't know what mode of disruption exists outside of some kind of education, whether it is political education in the Highlander folk school sense or the Ella Baker school sense of it, or in some form of traditional public school education setting, whether it's the Afrocentric charter school movement up through HBCUs, et cetera. I mean, it seems to me that's the battleground for the social policy work that we can engage in a collective project that is not predicated on what my mama, my daddy, my neighbor, my preacher told me. Because while your job is to train theologically future ministers to make that case, that is also an educational project. So I don't want to say I'm cynical, but it seems like the forces arrayed against the kind of moral and spiritual courage that you are describing have only grown over the past 50 years. And so I'm trying to figure out what are the modes of disruption that we can actually gain access to or mobilize, since we already have access but may not be doing enough. But it's a great dilemma.
Thank you, Professor Muhammad. I'm back here.
Yes.
I feel like I grew up in a tradition of going to Wednesday night prayer meetings, and I feel like I was in a Wednesday night prayer meeting with your lecture. Thank you. I just wanted to say Galatians 6:9, and let us not grow weary in doing good, because we shall reap if we faint not. So I just wanted to put that out there because I know it is complicated and depressing and distressing, and people are dying from all class positions, whether they're elite or the most impoverished, because it's weary, it's tiring. It's tiring to even talk about this. Why can't we talk about something else? Why we got to have you up here talking about this hard truth?
Right.
We would love to hear another aspect of your psychology and your wisdom, but we're thankful for this. I just want to say that. But I guess my question is really, I'm interested in, because you're talking very black and white, and we understand now, especially in this country, it's so much more complicated. Not only are black people reproducing white supremacy, Asian people are reproducing white supremacy. What about the indigenous population and all of these? I'm just wondering, it would really help if you can kind of trouble the waters around race, so that we're also seeing how white supremacy and capitalism which is what I understood what you were saying, these kind of systems, whoever buys into them and perpetuates, that's how the oppression continues. I just wanted to see if you had any thoughts about diversifying the way race is being used in what you're talking about so far. And thank you again.
So that's a subject that I do take up in this project and in my teaching. What I've centered here is the language of blackness and white supremacy as a form of currency. And that currency can be appropriated or spent by any group. One example that I'm very fond of teaching, because it's such a rich way to teach students who don't think about, say, Chinese Americans through the prism of model minority myths. There's a precise genealogy going from a degraded class of human beings as immigrants going back to the late 19th century that brought with it some of our first border closings, as well as deportation or definitions of criminal illegal aliens. That was applied to Chinese immigrants, to a population by the late 30s, 40s into the 50s had been made over into a community of hardworking immigrants who were not like black people, whose identity was divorced from an affirmative recognition of their very old Asian identity to something that served a white power structure's definition of these not like black people prove that racism is not a problem in America. And most of my understanding of that history comes from the work of a colleague named Ellen Wu, who wrote a book called The Color of Success, and it's brilliant. And she looks at Japanese Americans and Southeast Asian, or South Asian immigrants as well. So I won't extend the point any more than to say that I'm both aware, incorporating, and discussing that in this work, but it doesn't change that blackness remains the currency through which these other social identities and formations are channeled through, and how power and resources are redistributed in society.
I think it's my turn.
Hey, Vakari.
How you doing, brother?
All right.
I have a question and a comment. The comment is, I think it was interesting you followed this trajectory from E. Franklin Frazier through the Future of the Race, skipping over Nathan Hare's book, The Black Anglo-Saxons. Yeah. And I think that that leans into me to what Dr. West is saying, as well as the Jack and Jill brother who I think left.
I'm recording, by the way, so it doesn't look, I'm not being dismissive of your comments. Yeah.
Okay. And so what I wonder is, as you take this deep examination of this black middle class or black elite, whatever you want to call it, where is the measure of the politics and the ideology? And I think that's really the strength of what Tommy Shelby's book that you talked about. I can't remember the title.
We Who Are Black.
We Who Are Black, right. I think
or
that's
dark. We Who Are Dark.
We Who Are Dark, right.
Yeah.
I think that's really the strength of that text is it takes up a question of what are the politics, what is the ideology, and how do you measure it? And I think that to just kind of talk broadly about people who are channeling through these institutions without any sense of how do we really measure their politics outside of the mainstream American electoral politics system, to me, I think that will be a gap in really kind of measuring what's happening with these people. And I think the brother from Morehouse, I think that's kind of, to me, where he's leaning in. Just kind of curious, like, is there a way to measure this? Is it important, and how would you do it?
Yeah. So I mean, so a lot of that work. This is why I name-checked Tommy, because I wanted to acknowledge that the work of classification, a kind of taxonomy of black ideology, has really driven a lot of the work, including my own grad advisor, David Levering Lewis, who wrote the 2 volumes on Du Bois. Even though it was biographical in its narrative and analytical approach, it was a distillation of the full range of ideas that Du Bois encountered in his journey, both in his own head and amongst others. So I'm not trying to reproduce that right now, because essentially that is on its own terms a project. I'm trying to learn from that work and trying to say that even if we took the diversity of perspectives of black nationalism, of black Marxism, of black conservatism, split those up into 40 different branches for each one, we still have to wrestle with a simpler problem, which is to say that most black people and I've, again, tried to keep elite in a very broad sense, but people who other white elites come to try to understand why black folks are so angry, why there's so many in prison, why they can't learn. These are not questions that dissertate on the taxonomies of black nationalism. They usually distill to, unfortunately, kind of 3 perspectives. One is that the black poor are undeserving of any sympathy. They need to get their act together, which is the one that I gave you, the 0.01%. I'm not interested right now in relabeling that. In the 1980s, it would have been conservative. Today, it would be neoliberal. I'm not sure what it's going to be after Trump is out of office. It could resurge. It could go away. The second is that we need to do more redistribution of opportunity, of education, so on and so forth. This would be the liberal view. The third, which is less popular, would be that I don't expect black people, I'm sorry, I don't expect white people to do very much for black people, and so I'm doing as best I can within my own community, even to a white person. You know, kind of recognition of irredeemable white supremacy means that black people have to turn inward. And so while I work here, that's fine, well and good, but my real work is back in the community doing X, Y, and Z. Now, those three broad examples communicate different things to a white power structure or an elite counterpart. And what I am saying is that the dominant response has consistently been that we've done what we could in terms of legislative change, now black people have to do for themselves. And they meant that to be the liberal perspective on a kind of, I believe in black people and opportunity, but this is mostly a function of their choices. This is the personal responsibility interpretation of this. And what I'm trying to suggest is that you can't have it both ways. A white elite person can't accept, and I'm not talking about conservatives and the people on the right. I'm saying the average folks who run corporate America, who may support a Trump here and there, but generally are not associated with the extreme right. The Republican Party is, I don't want to get in the weeds of this, but the Republican Party is not what it was even 10 years ago. So if you take as a given that corporate America has the capacity to be an agent of some form of good, redistributive good, either in opportunity structures or leaning into change, like Google's Black History Month Super Bowl ad, for example. Or the fact that in Atlanta, it was the business community that kept Atlanta from becoming a Birmingham. That it's those spaces of exchange between black elite and white elite that, in light of the last 50 years, suggests to me that there's been too much agreement that there isn't a structural racism problem in America. There isn't a white supremacy problem in America. That's why I kept bringing up the broken black bodies problem. And to me, that's not a problem that turns on further categorization of different strains of black ideology. That's kind of recognizing that there's only so many ways that you are going to express resistance in these positions of power to tell white folks, no, I am not going to be here at Wells Fargo and participate in credit schemes when it comes to black bankers. Like, that's a choice. I mean, literally, it's a choice. It's not an abstraction. In all of these environments, not always at the top, but most certainly somewhere in the food chain, is a black person where someone's making a decision that is harmful to the black community. And so to me, I don't know what we label that. I'm not even sure that there is, beyond what I've started to do, which I admit is a start, if there is an intellectual or ideological tradition that can account for that. Because most of the 20th century writing has been imagining the damage of segregation and the possibility of integration, and then an assessment of what integration or desegregation didn't deliver, with still the hope that more black firsts and seconds and women of color in positions of power would solve the problem. And here we are. So that's not to dismiss the need for that work. I am suggesting that I'm leaning on that work in order to focus in this other way, if that makes sense. And if it doesn't, let me know, because I won't get this right.
Yes, a marvelous speech. I really enjoyed, and especially also the question answer session clarified a lot of my questions. But I was thinking all along as I was listening to you and conversation about Fanon, about Tagore, his notion of universal identity, and in that relation also critique of Papaya's universalism, and and Sri Aurobindo. So I was wondering, I mean, recommendation of the book is like Humanitarian Identity, Political Sublime, Intervention of a Post-Colonial Feminist, or Negotiating Capability and Diaspora, Philosophical Politics. Also Amartya Sen's Theory of Capability. So as you can see, I was very happy to hear this question here of other races. And So what do you think of, you mentioned, yes, we need to be aggressive. I mean, if you're too passive, you're not going to go anywhere. But where do you strike the balance? I mean, I'm not saying they have to, spirituality is needed. Maybe it's the best way to express it as philosophical politics. But, or could politics can merge, join hand with some kind of real ethics, if not spirituality? So if I would like to hear, what are your thoughts on that? I know Dr. West, Race Matters, and everywhere he talks about it, and great admirer, but it was very nice to listen to you as well.
So I thank you. I hope I got those titles, and I'll make sure if I don't, I'll follow up. So part of this is a tension between the kind of what I would call real politique of black leadership. And by that I mean people get up and go to work every day in civil society, and the micro experiences that they have amount to macro consequences. That's the lane I'm trying to pursue here, which will fail to satisfy all of the philosophical and intellectual questions that can be raised by making such a pragmatic claim. At the end of the day, all of us are vulnerable to decision making. I mean, here we are at Harvard. We're in the midst of this, ridiculous Lorgia situation over tenure, and aside from it making absolutely no sense, there's no accountability whatsoever. And so, where does our complicity begin and end? I don't know. But it seems like we shouldn't be here. And so there's a tension for me between knowing enough about the Afro-pessimist traditions, for example, of which you're, I think, playing with in the question. I just read and blurred Frank Wilderson's book on Afro-pessimism, and his position is that we are the way in which other people gain their humanity. Hard stop. And so that poses all sorts of leadership crises, including maybe the elite have it right. Like if in the end there's nothing, if there's only darkness, why not enjoy the ride? Or as Don King said, the best I can do for poor black people is not be one of them. That is a very dystopic view, but it's one that can be argued and defended, but it's not one that any one of us can take to the bank in terms of getting up and going to work every day. So that's the tension for me between sort of facing the darkness through Fanon or anyone else as clearly and as bravely as possible, the catastrophe of death. I mean, Koerner has spent his entire career helping us to recover traditions of both acknowledging the catastrophe of death and then living in joy and resiliency and beauty in spite of it. But I would say, and this may be overly crass and glib, but Koerner is not guiding most of the black leadership class anymore.
That's a fact.
Yes. So he's still teaching, we're getting smarter, but they're getting dumber. I don't know what other word to put on it. And so there's a gap. And part of what I'm trying to figure out is, where is that gap? Have we talked ourselves into very small academic spaces that no one's listening? Maybe, in some ways. Are we being actively marginalized by corporatist universities like our own that both celebrate our presence and deny the significance of what we actually do? Absolutely. And is that abetted by a handful of very successful black people who we all know in this room are the ones who are whispering in the ears of their white colleagues on boards of corporations or anything else, saying, don't divest of fossil fuels, don't worry about that whole prison thing? I'm on a couple boards. I'm telling you this in part because I've seen this work. And so I'm trying to, with this work and the traditions that are represented by the people in this room, and Skip from afar and anyone else whose work has been evoked in this space, as well as the work of others who I've not yet encountered, trying to apply some of this knowledge in ways that might actually change behavior. But, you know, it's difficult work. Yeah. Thank you. Last question. He's been.
Well, thank you for this lecture. My name is Ian Rowe. I run a network of public charter schools in New York City, in the heart of the South Bronx and Lower East Side of Manhattan. We've got more than 2,000 students, almost exclusively Black and Hispanic, almost exclusively low-income kids. And the kids we serve, the kids we educate, are in communities that are inundated with messages of how structural barriers around race, poverty, class will impede their ability to be successful. But our parents send their kids to our school to show them that that does not have to be the inevitable outcome for their lives, right? So I come to this with what's the orientation for what we teach the next generation about how they can succeed in this country. So for example, there's a ton of data out there that says that if you follow a certain series of decisions, finish high school degree, work, marriage, then children, have a faith commitment, your likelihood of being in poverty is almost nil, right? So we make that a huge part of the broad-based curriculum that we teach our kids so that they don't feel that they're doomed to fall prey to all of these structural barriers that we're so focused on. How do you, when you think of curriculum, how important, because this is part of our history too, the success, the resiliency, the fact that there is this Black middle class that has adopted certain bourgeoisie norms that have turned out to be successful, at least for a component of our community. Where's the balance for focusing on that as well?
Yeah. So this, I appreciate the question because I think this is the hardest question to answer. And by that I mean, I would say we already have over-indexed for the Black middle class success story. I mean, I'm beginning to do research on what's called racial socialization, which in child development literature means how Black children and white children are taught about the meaning of race and racism in America. And so it is true that Black children are often taught how to survive a racist society by anticipating X, Y, and Z. They are often, and even more so, taught that if they do X, Y, and Z, they're going to be successful. That's why the Harvard Business School Rules of Success is meant to be a signifier of a way of communicating through mentorship and motivational speaking that essentially if you play by the rules, America will reward you for it. The only way that we can reconcile the facts of inequality and disparity and structural racism with that message, which is an Obama era and not long ago message, I'm not interested in blaming everything on Trump, is to then say, well, the Black people who weren't making it, something's wrong with them. And the missing ingredient in most education, I don't know anything about your charter school or the network that it's a part of, the vast majority of public education experiences, and I can only speak for the places I've worked in, Indiana University and Harvard, do not teach political education. They do not teach people how to change government. They do not teach people how to actually have a productive critique, which means the kind of work you choose to do is a work that will change the system. Going to Wall Street is not going to change the system. It might put money in your pocket that, like Robert Smith, you can then redistribute. Nothing wrong with that, unless you give it away on terms that reinforce the wisdom of the system, which is the problem of philanthropy more generally. I'm not blaming Robert Smith for it, but that is a problem in and of itself. Quick side note, 20% of all philanthropy goes to structural change. 80% goes to reinforcing capitalism, essentially saying if the system works, see, we're giving our money away, love capitalists. So there's a real opportunity to take the high road There's a real opportunity to go back to the traditions of Septima Clark, to go back to the traditions of Ella Baker, to take Barbara Ransby and Kathy Cohen's work happening right now and say, this is what a quality education, not just for black children, but for white children, for Asian children, for Latinx children, for indigenous children means in America today. This is not the radical leftovers and artifact or legacy of the Black Power era that this small cabal of black feminist anti-racist women get to have in their little elite university, which of course the right has been attacking for the last 40 years, saying don't send your kid to college because they're going to be infected by socialist radical ideas. I mean, when the right is complaining about something, you know you're doing something right. So this is my point. I don't know enough about your school or what it teaches, but my guess for most schools is there's a whole lot more we could be doing with our kids in those schools. And it ain't just about our kids, because no matter how much we fortify our kids with the perfect balance of optimism and realism, they are still encountering a vast universe of majority white population of kids out there, and increasingly honorary white kids of all shapes, sizes, colors of the rainbow, who are going to try to deny their humanity. Thank you.